The ballroom at the Plaza Hotel shimmered like something borrowed from a dream. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across white roses and ivory silk. A string quartet played softly near the marble staircase. Every detail had been chosen with care, every petal placed, every candle lit, as if perfection could be arranged like centerpieces on a table. I stood at the edge of the dance floor, fingers laced with my husband Daniel's, breathing in the scent of lilies and champagne. His thumb brushed gently over my knuckles. "You okay?" he whispered. I nodded. "I am now." The truth was, I had been waiting for this day my entire life, not just to marry Daniel, but to feel chosen. To feel valued, to feel seen. Daniel leaned down, his forehead resting briefly against mine. "Whatever happens tonight, remember this is about us. Whatever happens." He knew my father would be here. Across the room, my father stood stiffly near the bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He wore a tailored tuxedo, but even expensive fabric couldn't soften the sharpness in his expression. He hadn't smiled once during the ceremony, not when I walked down the aisle, not when Daniel lifted my veil, not even when we kissed. My mother hovered beside him like a shadow, murmuring something I couldn't hear. He gave a short nod, but didn't look at her. The speeches began after dinner. Daniel's best man made everyone laugh. My maid of honor cried halfway through hers. Applause echoed warmly around the room. Then the MC smiled and said the words I'd been dreading. "And now the bride's father would like to say a few words." A silence settled over my chest. My father walked toward the microphone with measured steps, confident, commanding, the same way he used to enter a room when I was little. Like the world rearranged itself around him. He cleared his throat. "Well," he began, scanning the crowd. "I suppose this is the part where I talk about how proud I am." A few guests chuckled politely. He glanced at me. His eyes weren't warm. Raising a daughter isn't easy. He continued, "Especially one with ambition." The word landed strangely. "I always told her," he said, lifting his glass slightly, "that if she wanted the finer things in life, she'd better find someone who could afford them." The laughter this time was thinner. Uncertain, my heart began to pound, and look at that. He added, gesturing toward Daniel with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. She did. A ripple moved through the room. Daniel's grip tightened around my hand. My father took a slow sip of whiskey before finishing. "I guess you could say my daughter always knew how to secure a good investment." He paused deliberately. "Some might call that smart, others might call it gold. Digging." The word dropped like shattered glass. Gasps, forks clinking against plates, a chair scraping loudly somewhere near the back. My face burned. For a second, I couldn't breathe. My father smiled into the microphone, as if he'd delivered the punchline of a harmless joke. "I'm kidding, of course," he added lightly, mostly. But the damage was already done. I felt every pair of eyes in the room shift toward me. Measuring, wondering, judging, my father raised his glass toward Daniel. "Take care of her. She has expensive taste." Daniel didn't smile back. Instead, he leaned toward me and whispered, "You don't deserve that." But the humiliation crawled up my spine anyway, familiar and suffocating. I was 12 again, showing him my honor roll certificate, while he asked why it wasn't first place. I was 16, telling him I'd earned a scholarship, and hearing him say, "Must have been a diversity thing." I was 24, signing the lease for my first office while he told relatives I was playing businesswoman. And now, on the happiest day of my life, he had reduced me to a stereotype. The applause that followed was scattered and uncomfortable. As my father stepped away from the microphone, I noticed something else. At table 6, near the edge of the room, a man in a charcoal suit sat quietly, observing everything. He hadn't laughed, hadn't flinched, hadn't reacted at all. He simply folded his hands on the table and met Daniel's eyes for half a second. A silent exchange passed between them. Then the man gave the smallest nod. I didn't understand it yet. All I knew was that my father thought he had just humiliated me in front of 200 guests. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the night wasn't over. And neither was I. The word Golddigger didn't just echo in the ballroom. It echoed through my childhood. Long before the chandeliers of the Plaza Hotel, before the silk gown and the diamond ring, before Daniel ever held my hand, There had been a small dining room table where my father sat, head like a king guarding a fragile throne. I was 8, the first time I realized love in our house came with conditions. My brother Mark had brought home a report card with 2 B's. My father clapped him on the back like he'd won a championship. "That's my boy," he said proudly. That same week I brought home straight A's. He barely looked up from his newspaper. "Good," he muttered. "That's what's expected." Expected. That word became the measuring stick of my worth. Nothing I did was exceptional, only required. If I excelled, it was obligation. If I failed, it was proof I wasn't good enough. When I won a regional debate championship at 16, my father's response was, "Well, arguing comes naturally to you." When I earned a full academic scholarship to college, he told relatives, "Tuition discounts aren't what they used to be. Colleges hand those out like candy." Candy. As if my late nights studying, the part-time job I worked through high school, the applications I filled out while everyone else slept, were sugar tossed into a bowl. By the time I turned 22, I understood something clearly. If I wanted validation, I would have to build it myself. So I did. I launched my consulting startup from a 1-bedroom apartment with second-hand furniture and a borrowed laptop. I pitched to clients who didn't take me seriously because of my age. I reinvested every dollar I earned. I lived modestly, carefully, strategically. When I finally turned a profit, I invited my parents to dinner to celebrate. My father sipped his wine and said, "Let's see how long that lasts." I smiled tightly across the table. "It's stable. I've signed long-term contracts." He shrugged. "Businesses run by emotion don't survive. You're not built for this world. Not built for this world." I carried that sentence like a splinter under my skin. Then I met Daniel. We met at a leadership conference in Chicago. I was a panel speaker. He was in the audience. He asked a thoughtful question about scaling ethically without losing company culture. Afterward, we spoke for an hour about strategy, risk, and resilience. He never once asked about my family's name. Never once commented on my appearance before my ideas. When I told my father about him, his first question wasn't, "Is he kind?" or "Does he treat you well?" It was, "What does he make?" When I answered honestly, my father let out a low whistle. "Be careful," he said. "Men like that don't marry girls like you unless there's something in it for them." "Like what?" I asked. "Access," he replied, "or they're being hunted." The implication was clear. I was the hunter. Months later, when Daniel proposed, my father pulled me aside before I could even admire the ring properly. "I hope you understand what people are going to think," he said quietly. "I don't care what people think." "You will," he replied. "They'll assume you secured a comfortable future." "I already have a comfortable future," I reminded him. He smiled thinly. Comfortable is relative. What he never knew, what he never bothered to ask, was that my company's revenue had quietly surpassed his struggling firm's annual earnings the year before. He didn't know I had diversified investments. He didn't know that when Daniel and I discussed a prenuptial agreement, I insisted on it not to protect him, but to protect us both. "Love should be clean," I told Daniel, "no shadows." He kissed my forehead and said, "I love that about you." But my father never saw love. He only saw leverage, and so, on my wedding day, when he stood beneath glittering chandeliers and called me a gold digger, it wasn't a spontaneous insult. It was the culmination of years of quiet erosion. He had spent a lifetime convincing himself that my success had to belong to someone else, because if it didn't, then he had underestimated me. And my father had never been wrong a day in his life. Or so he believed. The air in the ballroom still felt fragile after my father's speech, like a glass that had cracked but not yet shattered. Conversations resumed in low murmurs. Cutlery clinked cautiously against porcelain. The string quartet restarted, but even the music seemed unsure of itself. Daniel's hand never left mine. "Do you want to step outside?" he asked softly. I shook my head, no. "If I walk out now, it looks like you won." Daniel studied me for a moment, something steady and resolute behind his eyes. Then he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible. Across the room at table 6, the man in the charcoal suit adjusted his cufflinks. Most guests assumed he was another executive friend of Daniel's, just one more tailored presence among many. But I knew who he was. Jonathan Pierce, Daniel's corporate attorney, meticulous, surgical, the kind of man who could dismantle a company with a fountain pen and a polite smile. Jonathan had been part of our lives for over a year, not because of Daniel's wealth, but because of my father's desperation. 3 months before the wedding, my father's company, Whitmore Industrial Supply, had been spiraling. Poor investments, outdated infrastructure, risky loans. He had hidden it well from most people, but numbers don't lie. Vendors were pulling contracts, banks were tightening pressure, and pride, unlike capital, cannot be refinanced. One evening Daniel came home unusually quiet. "What happened?" I asked. He loosened his tie. "Your father requested a meeting." My stomach tightened. "With you," he nodded. "He wants a private investment, a significant one." Of course he did. I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because it was inevitable. "What did you say?" "I told him I'd consider it," Daniel replied, "but only after due diligence." Due diligence. That was when Jonathan entered the picture. What my father didn't know was that months earlier, I had already been monitoring his company's financial distress. Not out of spite, out of instinct. Despite everything, he was still my father, and I wasn't interested in watching the business he built from scratch collapse under mismanagement. But I also wasn't interested in begging him to let me help, so I structured something smarter. Through a quiet investment group, one that shielded individual identities, I began acquiring minority stakes in his outstanding debt. Legally, methodically, patiently, Jonathan oversaw every signature. "You're sure about this?" he asked me during one meeting in his downtown office. "Yes, he may never know you were the one who stabilized it." "I don't need him to know," I said. "I just need him not to lose everything." But things escalated. When my father approached Daniel for a bailout, he unknowingly triggered a clause in the debt restructuring agreement. A clause that allowed majority consolidation if certain thresholds were met. Those thresholds were met 2 weeks before my wedding, which meant that, as of 14 days ago, controlling interest in Whitmore Industrial Supply no longer belonged to my father. It belonged to the investment group. It belonged to me. Back in the ballroom at the Plaza Hotel, my father laughed loudly at something one of his friends said, already recovering from his own cruelty. He believed he had secured the upper hand, publicly diminishing me in a room full of witnesses. What he didn't realize was that Jonathan had been invited for a reason. Daniel leaned slightly toward table 6. Their eyes met. Jonathan gave a subtle nod. Everything was in place. I felt my heartbeat slow instead of race. A strange calm settled over me. Not revenge, hungry, not vicious. Certain, for years, my father had weaponized doubt. He had chipped away at my confidence so quietly that no one else could see the erosion. He assumed that humiliation would keep me small, but he had mistaken silence for weakness. He had mistaken patience for incapability. Daniel squeezed my hand once more. "We can let this go," he whispered. "You don't owe anyone a response." He was right. I didn't owe anyone anything, but I also wasn't going to let my wedding day become another chapter in the story of my inadequacy. Across the room, Jonathan calmly lifted his glass of water, not in celebration, but in readiness. The documents were finalized. The filings were complete. The signatures were binding. My father had called me a gold digger. He had no idea that the ground beneath his own empire had already shifted, and that the woman he tried to shame was the one holding the deed. And this time I wasn't 8 years old waiting for approval. I was the strategy. The room held its breath. The soft hum of the quartet had quieted to a mere whisper, as if even the music sensed that something monumental was about to unfold. My father, confident and smug, sipped his whiskey and leaned back in his chair, convinced he had triumphed with a single word. "Golddigger," I rose from my seat. The silk of my gown shifted with the movement, a gentle rustle that drew eyes toward me. I held the microphone without trembling. I didn't need to. The years of belittlement, of whispered doubts and thinly veiled insults, had forged in me a calm, unshakable fire. "Thank you," I began, my voice steady yet warm, "for all the speeches tonight, for the laughter, and even for the lessons." A few eyebrows rose, curious. I allowed a small smile. Lessons, I repeated, about resilience, about ambition, about not letting anyone define your worth. I turned slightly toward my father, meeting his gaze directly for the first time all evening. He blinked. Confusion flickered across his features. You see, I continued, life has a funny way of teaching us exactly what we need to learn. Sometimes it comes from friends, sometimes from mentors, and sometimes it comes from the people who doubt you the most. The room was silent now. Even the servers had paused mid-step. I know tonight my father called me a gold digger. He suggested in front of everyone that my marriage was built on money rather than love. I let the words hang, careful and deliberate. And perhaps in his eyes that might have seemed true once, but tonight I think we can all agree that love and respect are what truly build a life together. I paused. The silence was palpable. My father's grip on his glass had tightened. I sensed the tension radiating from him, the sudden awareness that something had shifted, though he didn't yet know what. And speaking of building, I continued, there's another lesson here, one about legacy, about protecting what matters, about responsibility. I let my gaze sweep across the room, finally landing on table 6. Jonathan Pierce, Daniel's attorney, gave a subtle nod, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but I felt the quiet satisfaction of the plan falling into place. Whitmore Industrial Supply, I said softly, letting my words settle like dust in the chandeliers. A company my father built with his hands has faced challenges recently. I won't pretend that I did not notice those challenges. Nor will I pretend I ignored the opportunity to help. Murmurs rippled through the room, my father's face drained of color. Through careful planning, through patience, and through legal diligence, the company has been stabilized. It is financially secure, and its future is protected. I allowed my words to land fully, their weight pressing like a stone in the air. It is under new leadership, responsible leadership, leadership that understands value beyond arrogance and legacy beyond ego. I turned fully toward my father now, my voice softer but cutting in its clarity. That leadership, Father, is mine. The room went utterly silent. A pin could have dropped and been heard. My father's glass slipped slightly in his hand, unheeded, as the realization set in. This isn't about revenge, I said, voice unwavering. This is about truth, about respect, about showing that underestimating someone, dismissing them, mocking them, does not determine their limits. You can try to shame someone, to belittle them, even on their happiest day, but sometimes the quietest victories are the most complete. I stepped back from the microphone. The guests were still frozen, some whispering quietly to each other, their faces a mixture of astonishment and admiration. Daniel's hand found mine again, steadying me, his eyes filled with pride and love. My father's lips parted, but no words came. He finally set his glass down and lowered his gaze, pale and silent, as the weight of the revelation sank fully into him. He had called me a gold digger, never realizing that the gold digger had quietly taken control of the very company he cherished. From table 6, Jonathan lifted his glass in a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture. Daniel's lips curved in a private smile. Revenge, I realized fully in that moment, does not need to shout. It does not need to be dramatic. It does not need to humiliate with cruelty. Sometimes the sweetest, most elegant revenge is simple. It is truth revealed at the perfect time, with grace, precision, and unshakable dignity. I returned to my seat, my hand still in Daniel's. The applause started slowly, then built, filling the room with warmth. I didn't look at my father anymore, not with anger, not with hate. I looked at him only with the calm satisfaction of knowing that for the first time, he truly understood. Underestimating me had been his greatest mistake.